Hello, World History. Welcome to U15-L13 Basics of World War II, Part 3. This is the last lecture video of the unit. Yay! All right, learning targets describe the social, political, and economic causes and main turning points of World War II. Describe the causes and consequences of the Nazi Holocaust, including the effects of the Nazi regime's war against the Jews and other groups. Your job, watch this Edpuzzle. Any question in blue text is going to be a question I want you to answer directly on the Edpuzzle. Red text are important concepts, so make sure you're following along with your study guide. And of course, if you have any questions, please let us know. Focusing on Europe. So we are going to start with France falling to Germany. Now, this occurs June 1940. So let me be clear that the US has not entered the war quite yet. So remember, we talked about last time that the US enters the war in 1941. So this is 1940, so about a year before the US joins. So German forces break through something called the Maginot Line. So the Maginot Line was this concrete kind of wall that France built on the border of Germany. As you can see here in the picture, it's like kind of a bunch of poles that are sticking up from the earth. So this would be very difficult for soldiers, but mostly like, automobiles and tanks to get through. So Germany comes up with this really brilliant idea of how to get past the Maginot Line. They just go around it. So here in this map, you can see that the Maginot Line, it has a strong fortification where it is the solid red right here on the border of Germany and France. And then it's not very solid when it comes to the border between like France, Germany, and Belgium. So Germany is like, hey, we can't get through this way, so we're just going to go around. And that's exactly what they did. So Germany had control of France once they took over Paris. French General Charles de Gaulle, who's this dude right here, he flees to London. He sets up a radio show broadcasting from England. England and France are only about 40 miles apart. I know on a map it looks like they're like really far apart, but they're not, only about 40 miles. And he tells the French people to resist the Nazis through his radio broadcasts. All right, so France fell. Great Britain had to fight Germany alone. Because remember, the US hasn't entered quite yet. This is still in the year 1940. So Winston Churchill becomes the new prime minister, who's this dude right here. He declared Great Britain would never surrender. He said, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender. All right, next we're going to talk about the Battle of Britain. So this occurred July and August of 1940. So here's a map of the English Channel, by the way. So between here and here, which is England and France, you will see that this is only about 40 miles, so it's pretty close to each other. And Great Britain was at this point the main fighting force against the Axis powers because France had fallen to Germany and the US has yet to enter into the war. So Germany really wanted to overwhelm Britain. So they had a strategy, which was first to establish air superiority, meaning that Germany would send planes from France over Great Britain and just bomb the heck out of it. Then, once England is pretty much in rubble, they would send in ground forces, so like troops, to take over the rest of England. But that did not happen because Britain withstood German attacks. So, thanks to the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, so the RAF made this really cool new technology called the radar system, which helped prepare when and where airplanes and ships were. Then we also had the London Blitz, which occurred September of 1940. So German planes would come overhead and bomb London daily. They would end up dropping about 35,000 tons of bombs onto London. Germans also attacked other Great Britain cities, which was actually a good thing for Great Britain because it allowed the RAF time to rebuild radars and forces. And in retaliation, Great Britain would then send their planes to bomb the heck out of Berlin to strike fear into the Germans. So it was really the first all-air battle of World War II. It would end in September, and Great Britain would win the air battle. This is a really interesting photo. So this is a bunch of people in London, and they're sleeping in the subway tunnels because that was just the safest place to be. There are three reasons for Great Britain's victory during the London Blitz. The first was the development of radar. The next was the skill of the RAF. And the last was that the British government imposed a total blackout. So, why would a blackout help? So, here on this photo right here, you can see the blackout includes people putting like heavy drapery over their windows and turning off lights. Here's a photo of what London looked like during a blackout. Here's another photo. So, why would a blackout help? So, blackouts really helped because, as you can see here in this photo, it diminished light pollution in London so that the RAF could shine their big spotlights up in the air and spot German planes. But also, it'd be really hard for German planes to see what's below them, so they didn't quite know what they were bombing. All right, then we have the United States. So the US stays neutral during the war, well, at least until Pearl Harbor happened. And FDR uses the policy of isolationism. Remind me, what is isolationism? Yeah, it's when a country isolates itself from other countries' affairs, specifically at wartime. So the US passes the Neutrality Acts, which means that they're not going to send any arms to warring nations and they're not going to send any loans to warring nations, which is something that they broke because they did send arms to Great Britain. Then comes the Lend-Lease Act. So this happened in May of 1941. So again, the US has not officially entered World War II yet. They do that in December of 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So US saw that its friend Great Britain was really struggling in the war. So the Lend-Lease Act reverses some of the Neutrality Act and it provides military aid to Great Britain. But it also indicates that the United States has sided with Great Britain for World War II. So, during this time, secretly, President Roosevelt and Churchill were meeting. And during those secret meetings, they created something called the Atlantic Charter. So, the Atlantic Charter was a declaration of support, and they supported two main things. One was free trade among nations, and the second was the right of citizens to choose their own type of government. Now, let's switch to Germany versus Russia. Now, in the slideshow, I might say the USSR or the Soviet Union. Just know that all of these mean the same thing. All right, Germany attacks Russia. So in June of 1941 is when Germany really started to attack Russia. So prior to this, Hitler had taken over Yugoslavia and Greece, and Hitler starts to invade Russia, breaking the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, which we talked about, I think, like 3 videos ago. That was that pact that Germany and Russia had come together with, and they said, oh, let's split up Poland in half and not fight over it. Hitler breaks that. Then Hitler does something called Operation Barbarossa, where Hitler wanted to eliminate communism as well as eliminating the Jews in Russia. So Germany deploys the Einsatzgruppen in Russia, which is the mobile killing units. So they're made up of SS officers who would go into towns, they would round up all the Jewish people, they would make them dig their own graves, and then they would kill them and they would fall into their own graves. So the German army pushed the Soviet army back all the way into Moscow, and there were about 2 million Russian prisoners of war. But the tide will turn for Russia, and Russia will start winning once winter comes. So, note to self, never invade Russia in the winter. So, Germany had no winter clothes, they had the lack of food, and it was horrible winter conditions that year. So Germany was forced to turn back in December of 1941. It had about 730,000 German casualties because of their attacking on Russia. Now, I don't think I've talked about this before, but a casualty is not necessarily a death. It is when someone is either dead or severely injured. So that 730,000 might mean that someone maybe got like this horrible injury, and it could also mean death. So it's kind of grouped together into both. So let's switch to the United States getting involved in World War II. So, what else happened in December of 1941 again? Pearl Harbor. Yep. Remember, we talked about that last video. US enters World War II because of it. So, the Allied powers. Now it becomes United States, Russia, and Great Britain. Now, France is in there too, but they got invaded by Germany, so they're kind of useless at this point. There are other countries in the Allied powers as well that we don't really talk about. They include Australia, Belgium, Canada, China, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, India, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Panama, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. Wow. There is a lot of countries in the Allied powers. So the goal of the Allied powers was to fight until the Axis powers surrender. And the goal was also to fight in North Africa as well. Because remember, looking back into imperialism, there was a lot of colonies in Africa that some of these European countries had control of. So there are a lot of African battles that happened during World War II. Honestly, I don't really know much about World War II in North Africa. You will learn more in U15-L13. One of the most major battles, though, was the Battle of El Alamein, which is right here on the northern part of Egypt. That's where Germany and Italy wanted to take control of all of the North Africa, but Britain and the United States stops them in May of 1943. Then we have the Battle of Stalingrad. That's another really famous battle. So that occurred from August 1942 until February 1943. That's where Germany attacked Stalingrad, Russia. Russia stopped the German advancement on the Eastern Front, and it's really considered the turning point on the Eastern Front. Because beforehand, Germany had been pushing into Russia. Now, with the Battle of Stalingrad, Russia was pushing Germany out and back towards its own borders. Then we have the Tehran Conference. So this occurred November 1943. That's where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met in Tehran, Iran, and they discussed the end of the war and also the final assault on Germany. This is also the meeting where they thought up of D-Day. So D-Day is probably, if not like the most famous battle during World War II. So that occurred June 6th, 1944. That's where Allied soldiers were going to invade Nazi France. It was led by Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's this guy right there. He would go on to be a US president. More than 1 million men land on the beaches of France. Normandy Beach being the main beach of all. All right, so D-Day was very hazardous. There were underwater mines, there were barbed wires, there were machine guns, and there were about 10,000 Allied casualties. So here's a map of D-Day. So you can see that the Allied troops went from England and they sailed over here to France. Now, Germany knew that this attack was coming, but they didn't know where exactly the Allied forces were landing. So they ended up landing here on these beaches. So we have Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Then once they landed in those beaches, the troops would then spread out and conquer the rest of France. So here are some pictures of D-Day. So you can see here these kind of like boat things that would have all these soldiers in it. The hatch would come down and then the soldiers would start running out towards the mainland. Now, this is a very like pacifist photo of this because in a lot of the situations, there would be German snipers and machine gunners on the beach itself, and they would be shooting machine rifles at the soldiers. So the hatch would come down, the soldiers would be exposed, and they would pretty much get all shot down. So these guys were pretty lucky they did not have that. Here's another kind of photo of the other side of it. So you can see that the soldiers, again, made it out of this boat, and luckily there doesn't look like to be any machine gun soldiers up here. Here's another view. You can kind of see the soldiers getting up and over the beach. So taking back France. 3 months after D-Day, the Allies have over 2 million men in France. They break through the German lines and they take back Paris on August 25th of 1944. The Allies keep pushing past France and get into Germany. And this leads to something called the Battle of the Bulge. All right, kind of like with most of the battles that I talk about, this is the long story short. So, the Battle of the Bulge was the Allies versus Germany in December 1944 until January of 1945. It's really Germany's last stand in the war. So, it occurs on the border of Belgium and Luxembourg and the border with Germany. The Allies would end up winning, and they started to enter into the German borders. So here's a map of the Battle of the Bulge. As you can see here, there's this kind of like peninsula looking thing. So that's considered the bulge. And then you can see that the US forces are fighting this bulge. And eventually that bulge would break. The US forces would come through and they would start entering into Germany. So the ending of World War II. Soviets retook the land from Germany and they would enter Berlin in April of 1945. So you can see here is a Russian soldier on top of a building hanging a Russian flag. So in January of 1945, Hitler hides underground. April 28th, 1945, Mussolini is dead by a firing squad. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. So here is a photo of the inside of the underground bunker that Hitler was living in for a few months. Here's kind of a cool diagram showing what the bunker would have looked like and what the layout was. So you can see there's many different rooms. So the ending. In May 7th, 1945, Germany finally surrenders. It's known as VE Day or Victory in Europe Day. The war in Germany is over, but the war in Asia will still continue until August of that year. All right, talking a little bit more about the ending. So 21 million soldiers are dead after World War II. There are 40 million civilians who are dead. The biggest number of those civilians, being 28 million, were either Russian or Chinese. There's also displaced people. So 30 million people in Europe had no home and they had no country to go back to. The Germans are also expelled from the Sudetenland, which we talked about, I think, at the beginning of World War II. That was that little area of land on the German border. Poland also gets back its land that Germany stole. So the cost of war. The war cost about 4 trillion US dollars total. Economies of the world go back into a slight depression, but it's not as bad as the depression that occurred after World War One. There's also decolonization during this time. So Britain and France both want to keep their colonies. Where were their colonies again? I'll just answer that for you. So their colonies again were like in French Indochina, so that's like Southeast Asia, as well as India, and then places in Africa as well. So at the end of World War II, Britain and France did give up their colonies because Great Britain really didn't have the wealth or the military to maintain the colonies anymore. Then we had the Yalta Conference. So this was where the leaders would meet in the city of Yalta, Russia. It happened in February of 1945 with Stalin, right here, FDR, and Churchill. So Stalin wanted some sort of buffer zone between Russia and Germany, so some sort of land so they're not on the border with each other. FDR wants self-determination, which means that the former colonies would choose how they wanted to rule themselves. So all three of them agreed to allow former colonies to hold elections to determine their political system. Remember, the US is democratic, Russia is communist. This also created the United Nations, which we still have today, and they agreed that the Axis needed to surrender unconditionally. They would also create 4 zones in Germany for each of them to rule. So the red zone would be Russia's, the yellow zone would be the United States's, the one bordering France would be France's, and the green one would be Great Britain. Then we had the Potsdam Conference. So this occurred July of 1945. It had the US, Great Britain, and Russia again. At this point in time, FDR is dead. Yeah, he dies in office. So his VP Truman takes over. And again, it's held in Potsdam, Germany. So this is right after Germany surrendered. So Truman knows that the US has an ultimate weapon, which is the atomic bomb, and that atomic bomb would drop in Japan sometime in August. So Truman demands free elections throughout Eastern Europe. Stalin really hates this idea because free elections mean that communism isn't going to spread. Because remember, Stalin's the leader of Russia, Russia is communist. All of them agree that Japan has to leave all of its territories that it took, and all three agree upon the Nuremberg trials. So again, going back to this map here, so this is mainland Japan right here. Japan had all of this area in Asia. So all three of the Allied powers were like, no, Japan has to give those up. So then we have the Nuremberg trials. So those occurred from 1945 to 1949 in Germany. Nazis and other Axis powers were put on trial for war crimes for World War II and the Holocaust. So 22 major war criminals were tried. 12 were convicted and sentenced to death, 3 were convicted and sent to life in prison, and 4 were convicted to non-life in prison. So the trial shows that national leaders can be held responsible for war crimes against humanity. All right, now let's go back to Japan for just a few slides. So post-war Japan, like we talked about last time, after the atomic bomb drops in August of 1945, Japan surrenders. In August 14th, Japan officially surrenders, called VJ Day or Victory in Japan Day. The U.S. military occupies Japan after the war, and the U.S. government appoints Douglas MacArthur, who's this dude right here, to control Japan's government. So Douglas MacArthur began something called demilitarization, which was disbanding the Japanese military. And it's to stop the threat of war again. To this day, Japan is still not allowed to have a military. So today, Japan does kind of have a military. They just really can't call it a military. It's called the Japan Self-Defense Force, or the JSDF. It's like a military, but again, it's just not really called a military. They have about 247,000 members, and it's also a reason why the US has 23 military bases in Japan today. It's all because of this demilitarization that happened after World War II. So here is a map of all of the military bases that the US has in Japan as of 2016. All right, so under MacArthur, Japan also goes through something called democratization. So Japan created a new government and constitution for themselves. So they end up making a constitutional monarchy. So we've talked about constitutional monarchies before with Great Britain. So again, it's just like Great Britain's constitutional monarchy. So there's an emperor, or in Great Britain's case, a king, who is like a figurehead, but they don't really have any political power. Then elected officials and the prime minister have all the government power. So Japan is occupied under US rule until 1952. And today it still is to an extent with all the US military bases. So if you ever go into a house that maybe has older stuff, like an older person's house, you might look under one of their like vases or knickknacks or something like that. And you might see something like made in occupied Japan, because a lot of stuff was made in Japan during this time period. All right, let's wrap this up. Today we talked about Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, Battle of Britain, Atlantic Charter, Battle of Stalingrad, D-Day, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Battle of the Bulge, Nuremberg trials, demilitarization, and democratization. Next up, you're going to do U15-L14, Holocaust in Today. Then you're going to do U15-L15 through L19, which is the book thief. So with the book thief, I have abbreviated the title of it to TB Thief. So again, the book thief, TB Thief, yeah. I split up the movie into 30-minute chunks. There are 5 questions per 30-minute chunk, and I will be grading you on what questions you do get right or wrong. Then U15-L19 is only 4 minutes long, so there's no questions on that, but make sure you still watch it because I don't want to mark you absent over a 4-minute long video. Then for the week of May 5th through the 9th, you're going to do U15-L20, World War II North Africa. Answer the questions directly on the Ed puzzle. I will be grading what you get right or wrong. Then we have L21, which is the World War II video choice. Then we have U15-L22 and 23, Raiders of the Lost Art, which is the Monuments Men. Now, there is a Hollywood film called The Monuments Men. This is not that Hollywood film. So it's about a bunch of art was stolen by Nazis during World War II, and a bunch of these Allied soldiers were tasked to go find the hidden art. That is what this little documentary is about. Make sure that you answer those questions directly on the Edpuzzle because I will be grading you on what you get right or wrong. And still on week of May 5th through 9th, there's also the optional Unit 15 practice Kahoot. That's a really great study tool. And then take the Unit 15 test. So if you have questions, comments, or simply want to learn more, please let us know. That's why we're here. We're here to help you out. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.